all of us can see that there is an unmistakable increase in the level of what must be described as pro-fascist sentiment, as evidenced by especially the Donald Trump campaign, but I would say especially within the Republican Party primaries. Trump, by the way, as of this morning with the latest CNN poll, now has a commanding lead for registered and Republican-leaning registered Republicans and leaning Republican voters. It's 36%. Cruz, almost equally right-wing or as right-wing, has a 16% standing, and Ben Carson 14%. Between those three, that's 66% of the registered Republican voters. This is the day after Trump said that ISIL, so-called Islamic State fighters, not only to be killed, but their entire families wiped out, as he put it. He also said that he said this is, we have to do to the Muslim community that which would have been unthinkable a short while ago. He re-raised the fact that Obama may be a Muslim, meaning not an American really again. There is something going on with him that we don't know about, Trump said about Obama. Ted Cruz said, and this is right before this poll, if you are voting for Hillary Clinton, you are voting for Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader in Iran, to have a nuclear device. Whether or not the current administration realizes or wishes to acknowledge it, Cruz continued, our enemies are at war with us. I believe this nation needs a wartime president to defend it. So there is an undeclared war. That's what the candidates are announcing. Against who? It's really against the Muslim community, against the Arab American community, against those who have been targeted and demonized since the Paris massacre, especially in November 2013, that took the lives of 130 Parisians. The latest killing in San Bernardino, California, which took the lives of 14 people, another large number who were wounded by individuals who were Muslims or alleged to be Muslims. There is a wave of intense backlash and demonization and violence going on at mosques and against Muslim people. Muslim and Arab American parents are keeping their kids home in the last week. There is a rising tide of white supremacy and racism and violence, not only against Muslims and Arabs, but also in reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement. And you can see the shootings in Minneapolis where 5 demonstrators at a peaceful rally are shot. And you know, it elicited very little reaction in the media. I mean, it was the muted response to the shooting of peaceful protesters. When you think back to Kent State and to Jackson State and to, I mean, it's been decades since peaceful protests in Washington, in the United States, have been shot down. And there was kind of like a ho-hum reaction to it. A few people have been arrested now, but there was certainly no great hysteria. When Dylan Roof went into the black church in Charleston, South Carolina, and executed parishioners in that church, African American parishioners, there was no big, enduring campaign to round up white men who were racist in the South or anywhere else. In fact, as you all know, Dylan Roof was, before they took him to jail, they stopped off at Burger King and got him a hamburger because he was hungry. Likewise, the violent, deadly assault that was carried out at Planned Parenthood. All Muslims, every time some incident happens with Muslims, Muslims are asked to repudiate Islamic extremism, so-called. But here you have somebody going into a Planned Parenthood office and shooting the place up, killing people. Obviously, he didn't end up in the Planned Parenthood office because of a mental disability. He ended up in the Planned Parenthood office because the Planned Parenthood has been the target of ultra-right vitriol, propaganda, agitation, and attacks. And it's been carried out not simply by right-wing, right-to-life so-called, or right-to-death extremists, but by the main individuals who are the main candidates in the Republican Party. And again, during this whole campaign against Planned Parenthood, based on completely semi-fascist propaganda, stitched together videos, trying to demonize Planned Parenthood as if it's selling baby parts, and the shooter said no more baby parts. During that whole time, what was the reaction from the Democratic Party, or from Hillary Clinton, or from Bernie Sanders? I mean, again, this muted, ho-hum sort of lack of response. So the right wing continues to be on the march, employing methods of violence, threatening violence, as they have been doing during the past 7 years of the Obama administration, and the response is really very muted from the media and from the mainstream politicians who are the Republicans' supposed nemesis. Remember when Obama first introduced the Affordable Health Care Plan? A plan which was borrowed from Mitt Romney's Massachusetts Republican, let's privatize health care completely plan, and it was labeled to be communism in America. But the only good part of that was more people went to the Merriam-Webster dictionary to look up what communism meant. But aside from that, remember at those rallies, at the town hall meetings, when Congress people went back home in the summer recess, they were confronted by armed gangs. The people who were against Obamacare came with guns. They came to guns, and again the reaction was ho-hum. Can you imagine if the Black Lives Matter movement, or the anti-war movement, or the women's rights movement, or the LGBTQ movement started showing up when presidents and government officials have meetings to protest, and they come with guns, including semi-automatic weapons? Can you imagine what that was? But when these ultra-rightists came, it was just a ho-hum reaction. When people wonder how fascism comes into existence and how it finally is able to seize and take power, it's not just because the fascists are so bold. It's also because the main establishment bourgeois democratic forces who appear to be the main enemy of the fascists are so meek and mild in response. All the audacity and boldness rests with the ultra-right. People don't really know what fascism is and how it came to power in the classic places, say in Italy or in Germany. But in 1932, Hitler came to power, became named Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, and then set about to carry out the destruction of the left, the destruction of the unions, and of course the genocide against Jewish people, Roma people, gay people in Germany. But in the last election before Hitler came to power, which was in the summer of 1932, less than 6 months before, the combined vote between the Communist Party and the Socialist Party was 13.7 million compared to 11.8 million for the Nazis, meaning the combined socialist-communist vote, even in the last election before Hitler took power, the left was still stronger than the Nazis. And 2 years before that, the Nazis constituted 2 or 3% of the electorate. But what happened is that the mainstream politicians and centers of economic power, the banking elites, the corporate elites, all of those who ultimately sort of surrendered to Nazism in the lead up to it remained muted. And the communists and socialists, sadly, in 1931 and 32, pursued a policy of attacking each other instead of uniting with each other to destroy the Nazis. And so the Nazis came in, and the socialists said, well, the state will save us from Nazism. And the Communist Party, following in an erroneous position at that time, the German Communist Party, which was a very big party, said, well, the Nazis are just a reflection of capitalist bankruptcy, and should Hitler take office, everybody will see he can't solve the financial and economic crisis in society, and then we, the communists, the left, it'll be our turn. Well, it was never their turn, because as soon as the fascists came to power, they liquidated the left. They slaughtered them. They put them in concentration camps. The genocide at first was not against the Jewish community per se. The target was against the left. The genocide against Jews developed militarily and politically and bureaucratically over the next few years, but the immediate target was to destroy the left. That's the real target of the fascists. The apathy in the face of right-wing fascist mobilizations is a profound danger for society. And you don't have to look to Germany or Italy to find fascism in America. Fascism in America took the form of the KKK at its birth in 1865, the defeated slavocracy in the South. When the Northern Army was pulled out and came to Washington for a big celebration, the ex-slave owners didn't say, "Oh, I guess we lost." They immediately employed methods of genocide and terror to undo their defeat in the Civil War. And over time they won. They won by the employment of fascist methods. And the KKK, like the Nazis, or like the Italian fascists, or like the fascists you see in Venezuela, and there's a big fascist movement in Venezuela right now, which is threatening the Maduro government, they are not simply small military units of far-right, ideologically driven fascists. Fascism, to be successful as a movement, must be a movement. Fascism, to be successful, must have a mass character. It's not a small handful of right-wing ideologues. And you see in the United States, when Trump comes and has campaign rallies and 30 or 40,000 people come out, they're not being forced to come out. Nobody's paying them to come out. They're coming out because they're drawn to Trump. And Trump himself is not building a fascist militia, but you can be completely committed to the idea that beneath Trump, the individual, there are plenty of far-right fascist and violent organizations that are taking shape and being organized within this new movement. And the ruling class and the bourgeois Democratic Party politicians, they keep talking from what is presented as conventional wisdom, which is, oh, Trump is just like an anomaly. Trump will go away. The magic of Trump's weird, theatrics and reality TV type presentation, that will ultimately bring him down. But with each new violent episode in society, with each new crisis, Trump is getting stronger, as are the other far-right organizations. They are not weakening. You would think the killing of the Planned Parenthood would make it possible to bring out millions of women and men and people of all types to say, we're going to stand with women's right to choose. But instead of that, there's been a near passivity, a near silence. And so you have the shooters in Planned Parenthood, but outside of the shooters, in state legislatures all over the country, they're enacting laws that make it virtually impossible for women to have an abortion. Huge, vast parts of society are being denied. And that is a point of fascist organizing. Unfortunately, the places where the women's movement and the progressive movement is strongest, like Washington or New York or San Francisco or Chicago, the big cities, those are not the places where women are losing all of their rights. It's in Texas. It's in Mississippi. It's in all of these states around the country where the progressive movement is not strong. And so millions, tens of millions of women are being deprived of basic health care rights. And of course, who does it target? It targets working class and poor women. The same people who can go in and kill people in Planned Parenthood then say, but we are for the right to life. And a ho-hum response. we have to also think about where the danger or the foundation of fascist mobilization rests. It comes in a couple different directions. As Radica said in the beginning, part of the fascist mobilization is in response to the progressive movement when it gets stronger. You could see in the Confederate flag, which we're trying to have, all this mobilization against the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag only became a symbol in the South in 1963, in 1964, in 1965. It wasn't in the 1920s or the 1930s. People weren't running around with Confederate flags. That wasn't on state capitals. That was a response to the black civil rights movement's victories, especially the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1964 Voting Rights Act. Then suddenly Southerners wanted to, remember the great tradition of those who had died in the war between the states, so-called. I mean, it was a reaction to the black freedom struggle and to the victories of the black freedom struggle. That's one point of fascist mobilization. At the same time, and you'd be shocked to know it, in 1968, in Madison Square Garden, George Wallace had a rally to support his position which was for segregation and for the destruction of the Civil Rights Act. New York City, not Mississippi, not Alabama, but New York City, and he filled Madison Square Garden. 25,000 white racists came out in the middle of Manhattan to support George Wallace. That was a response to the victories that were going on with the black movement, the black civil rights movement. Another reason that fascist movements come into existence is because of unresolved class struggles. In other words, where there's high unemployment, where there's fights over wages, where there's strikes going on all the time, where the workers are mobilizing and the bosses are mobilizing against them, but there's no resolution to the class struggle. That's really what happened in Germany. Germany, where all the workers were voting socialist and communist, the fascists had no base of support. But the unresolved class issues at a time of profound economic crisis in Germany meant that the fascists came in and said, in essence, we will use the most extreme methods. We will use the most extreme methods of violence to destroy the left, destroy the unions, destroy the workers' organizations, and based on their resoluteness, big sections of the now pauperized German middle class came to their side because they showed resoluteness. And big sections of the industrial capitalist class finally decided that even though they had previously opposed Nazis, opposed the stormtroopers, that they would throw in with Hitler because at least Hitler could resolve the crisis of unresolvable or seemingly insoluble crisis within the class struggle. Fascism historically is a movement of the middle class. And that's another thing that we have to, I'm going to not talk too long because we want to get into a discussion about these issues. But the middle class is a key class in modern capitalist society. And if you look at Trump's rallies, or if you had the misfortune or assignment to go to a Tea Party mass rally after Obama came to office, those were not poor white people out there. They were middle-class white people. Those people were, they owned small businesses, or they had money. They felt oppressed by Obama. They felt oppressed by the system. Maybe the small middle class has lost some of its capability financially because of the dominance of the big capitalists, like Walmart, for instance, which drove out so many small business people. In other words, people who had or still have a previously or stable economic situation, not the very poor, but who felt either that their economic situation was going to be reduced or had been reduced as a consequence of the dominance of big capital. And of course you saw a lot of people in the middle class got wiped out in the 2007-2008 financial crisis. They were the middle class. And I think that when you look at the Trump rallies, they too are middle class people. It's not legions of poor white people. I mean, if Trump's base was poor white people, if that was the people coming, he couldn't start the debate by saying, yeah, I'm against not a $15 an hour minimum wage, I'm against any increase in the minimum wage. That's how he started the Republican primary. You can appeal to small business owners with that line, but you can't appeal to poor white people like, yeah, I'm going to make sure you never get a raise. Like, that's just not that appealing if you're poor, if you're a low-wage worker. But for small business people, it sounds great because they're the ones who employ people who make $7.25 an hour. They're the ones who will have a social benefit. So Trump and fascism historically appeals in a mass way to a section of society, the middle class, which is going through economic and social dislocation. How do we get the middle class? How do we get the middle class on the side of the working class? There's a mythology which is, and it's very prevalent in the left, which says you shouldn't be too militant, or you shouldn't be too resolute. You certainly should never be anything but passive and nonviolent, because otherwise the middle class will be turned off. We have to modulate our militant tactics so as not to alienate the middle class. The middle class is the most extreme and violent class in society. It's not moderate. It's not afraid of extremism. If it was, it couldn't be showing up at Donald Trump rallies. You know, that's not true. There's a slice of the middle class, which is unfortunately a liberal wing of the middle class that maybe is preoccupied with nonviolence. But you see, when Trump said about the black man who was part of the Black Lives Matter movement who yelled out at the rally in Alabama, and then this white mob stomped the hell out of him and beat him, and he only probably is alive because he was rescued by security guards. Trump got up and said, yeah, he deserved to be roughed up. That's popular with his supporters. Who are his supporters? They're the middle class. They don't mind violence. They don't mind extremism. When he says, well, we're going to not only kill ISIL fighters, we're going to wipe out their entire families. Well, you can't get more violent than that. That's illegal. It's against the Geneva Convention. Yeah, let's get their children and grandchildren and slaughter them too. I mean, these are the words of genocide. But people liked it. Not everybody, but the people who like Trump liked it. That's why they like him. He's showing resoluteness. Meanwhile, we have the women's movement, the trade union movement, our movement, not showing resoluteness. Just begging and pleading for politicians to do the right thing. I mean, if we really want to defeat fascism, which we must, it's an imperative need for everyone who's progressive, we have to be militant. We have to build fighting organizations. We have to say that we understand that the stakes are so high that we're not going to step back. We're not going to step back. And if some people say, well, you're too militant, let them say it. We realize and can see through history what it means what it means to be unmilitant in the face of fascism. Everything the left has done, the broad left has done, has been a step back. You even take the question of abortion. Abortion is never mentioned anymore by the left. It's reproductive justice. As if abortion really is a bad thing. As if it really is a sin. As if women deciding what to do with their own bodies and with their own children is somehow something that may be a terrible imposed necessity, but certainly nothing more than that. So the only sector of society that's talked about abortion for the last 30 years openly have been the right-wing opponents of women. And so now you see public opinion has shifted among younger women where there's more so-called pro-life sentiment than there was 30 years ago among young women. Now that just doesn't make any sense, except if you think about the left, meaning that part of the movement which is tied to the Democratic Party, has stripped the guts out of our own education, so that in the hope of not sort of infuriating or offending people, we drop language that then the right wing can take the language and use it to propagandize their own point of view. I'm going to speak for 5 more minutes and then we're going to open up for Q&A. In Venezuela, there's a danger of fascism because there's an unresolved class struggle. Maduro and Chavez, they've won 17 of the last 18 elections. The revolution keeps putting its viability to the test in very fair elections, as we said. They really are fair. Jimmy Carter said that it's the fairest election process ever. But anywhere. But what happens? You have 17 votes, and then the 18th vote you lose, and then you lose power? The revolution stops, the right wing comes in and to sabotage it? I mean, that's going to be a big question. If Maduro wins, the right wing will say it was an illegal election and it was based on fraud, and they're going to be in the streets promoting, I think, what that father said, fascist violence. Because that's, like Hitler, they'll know that they have to employ fascist methods. Hopefully in Venezuela, should that happen, the left will also employ methods to defend the revolution rather than saying, we'll wait just for the next election. Behind the scenes in Venezuela is the United States government, which has carried out economic war against Venezuela. There's an economic war, just the way Nixon waged a war against Salvador Allende when Allende was elected and tried to implement a peaceful road to socialism between 1970 and 73. Economic destabilization, great poverty, big parts of the middle class went into opposition, and then the CIA and the Pentagon came in for the coup de grace, assassinated Allende, killed 30,000 leftists in 3 weeks, and then imposed Pinochet on the people of Chile. The stakes are high. By not defending yourself, it doesn't diminish violence. By not defending yourself, it allows the fascists to carry out the unchallenged violence that allows them to win and then carry out dictatorship. Who's behind the Venezuelan war? It's not just Trump. It's the President of the United States. And that would be President Barack Obama and John Kerry. The United States government itself, as a matter of maintaining its imperialist empire in Latin America, while Obama is certainly not promoting fascism at home, is certainly willing to carry out economic tactics and strategies in Venezuela that will be conducive to the victory, possibly, of right-wing fascist forces, because then Venezuela will return to its position as a semi-colony of America, which is what the U.S. really wants. They don't care if it's fascist or not. In the Ukraine, on February 22nd, 2014, after Yanukovych meeting the protests in Maidan Square, the pro-Western, pro-European sectors of Ukrainian population, he came to an agreement with the United States, Poland, France, Germany, Russia, that the government in Ukraine would take the police out of downtown Kiev, and that they would have early elections and blah, 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 lots of reforms. And the day after the coup, and the day after the agreement was signed, Nazis wearing the symbols of swastikas stormed the parliamentary palace, seized the power, and carried out a fascist-led coup d'etat in the Ukraine on Russia's border. And those people declared a war against Russians and Jews. I mean, traditional fascism. And John McCain and John Kerry, at that moment, declared this is a new and great day for Ukraine. Why? Because Ukraine was being moved, they thought, into an American sphere of influence to be opposed to Russia on Russia's doorstep. Again, and I'll finish with this, when you look at ISIL, with its terrible attacks in Paris that killed 130 people, and they shot down or bombed a civilian airliner that was a Russian airliner when it flew from Cairo back to Moscow. And they bombed a peace rally in Turkey. And they carried out car bombings in the southern suburbs of Beirut, where the Shiite population lives, where it's considered the stronghold politically of Hezbollah. When ISIL did all this, we have to think, who is ISIL? Where did they come from? Before March 19, 2003, before the U.S. invaded and destroyed and fragmented Iraq as a national unitary entity, there was no such thing as ISIL or Daesh or Islamic State in Iraq. Before the United States and France and Britain destroyed the independent sovereign government of Gaddafi through merciless airstrikes in 2011, there was no such thing as ISIL in Libya. Gaddafi said, if you destroy my government, you'll be supporting Al-Qaeda. And everybody in the media said, oh, that's just rhetoric. He knew what the political and military forces were that were fighting him. Today, ISIL has a stronghold in Libya. Before Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the United States and Britain and France funneled millions or hundreds of millions of dollars of arms and weapons and money into Syria, into armed Syrian groups, there was no ISIL in Syria. So, remember in August, September 2013, when the U.S. almost went to war against Syria, the bombing that almost happened? John Kerry and Obama didn't say, oh, we're going there to fight ISIL. They said, we're fighting against the Assad government. But the Assad government is led by the Syrian Arab, has the Syrian Arab Army, the National Army of Syria. They've lost 85,000 people, 85,000 human beings, 85,000 Syrians are dead because they were killed fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and the United States at that time, and even today, refuses to join with them in the fight against ISIS because the United States said to do so means to support Bashar al-Assad, who's a secular nationalist government where women have had rights, religious minorities have had rights. Why did Assad get targeted? Because like Gaddafi, like Saddam, he was sitting at the helm of an independent country in a resource-rich, geostrategically important country, and the empire decided that they must all fall. So now ISIL has grown, maybe not as a conspiracy, but certainly as a consequence of the U.S. policies in the Middle East. And now when ISIL strikes Paris, or perhaps San Bernardino, or who knows where, when it's obviously not contained, when it's obviously not the JV team, the same forces, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and the fascists use the existence of ISIL to introduce fascist ideology, Islamophobia, and racism on a mass scale in the United States. And the point here is the empire, U.S. imperialism, the capitalist system, is organically spawning fascist movements all over the world, and the liberal Democrats, so-called liberal, they're not very liberal these days, but they too not only don't stand up to the fascists at home, but they carry out foreign policies that help create a fascist mentality and a fascist atmosphere in the United States. So our goal as a party, as a movement, is to build independent, militant mass actions in the coming months against Trump, the racist, the misogynist, the fascist. Meaning independent and militant, independent from the Democratic Party. If you think the Republicans are bad, so you must support the Democrats, I would say we've seen what the Democrats have provided for the last 7 years, which is not health care for all or an increase in living standards, but the spawning of a fascist movement that they themselves are incapable, really, of stopping.